morning, everybody in TV land. This is Mike Hittner with Historic Point Basse Update. And today, to my right, we got a special guest, Bonnie Wolfslegel. Welcome, Bonnie.
Thank you.
And Bonnie's been an active part of Historic Point Basse basically from the beginning, and was on the board, still is on the board now, and been on and off the board. Bonnie's one of those prolific ones, and what I would call our resident expert on Robert Wakely. And that's what we're going to talk a lot about today, about Robert Wakely and who he knew and how he got here. But this is one of her books that she has written, what is it now, Bonnie, 10, 12 years ago?
More than that, I think. Probably more like 20. 20
years ago. She wrote, this is just part of the series she wrote. And actually, she wrote one that's got all the books put together in a regular curriculum that you could use as a graded curriculum, they call that, Bonnie?
Yeah, it's aimed for fourth grade.
Fourth grade, and it's got questions and tests in there and that sort of thing. And the idea was, and we've had it used in the past by some of the schools, is the schools have a ongoing program studying Wisconsin history in fourth grade, and then they'd study in the classroom like 3 or 4 days and come out here for a visit, and then they'd actually see what they were studying. So it was a great idea, and we still have, I told Bonnie the other day, we still had a teacher had requested the other day, and the copy in the library is a little rough shape, so we're in the process of, in the next few weeks anyway, of putting together maybe 5 more of them, a few to sell and one to replace the one in the library. Today you can see we're in the Columbia School, an 1860s era schoolhouse from the town of Saratoga, located on the corner of Church and Highway 13. And moved out here by us, volunteers at Historic Point Basse, and it's used as our schoolhouse. Originally was going to be a schoolhouse and an interpretive center, and then Jean Fritz came and she loved one-room schools and taught in them, and it became kind of a project of its own, and now it's interpreted as a one-room school that it was used for many, many years, from 1860 to 1960. When they had the consolidation of the Wisconsin Rapid School System, it became into the Wisconsin Rapid System, and then it wasn't used anymore for a school. So it's kind of a nice place to meet. Bonnie and I are dressed up a little warm today. If you look at us and you wonder, well, they're wearing their coats and everything. For some reason, it's about 37 out, and it's maybe about 47 in here, I think.
The schoolhouse is historically accurate.
Today it's very accurate, and unfortunately the wood burning stove isn't hooked up, otherwise we could kick that in. But right now we're going to have a little work done on the furnace. But we're here today to talk about Robert Wakely, how the Wakeleys got to Point Basse. They were from upstate New York, who they might have found out about it from, because a lot of word traveled by word of mouth, and those Yankees from upstate New York and in the New England colonies were entrepreneurs, and they passed the word around and that sort of thing. So, Bonnie, how do you think the Wakeleys got here? I mean, there's a lot of, nothing is hard fact, but there's a lot of things that happen at the same time. So I think there's good reason to believe that it could have well happened.
Well, my theory is, and I've checked with various historical people, we do not know for certain. However, in doing research for the book, I came across a journal written by William Kemper, who was a Episcopalian missionary heading to Green Bay. And Daniel and Emmeline Whitney were on the boat that he got on at Buffalo. They also got on at Buffalo. They were returning to Green Bay after visiting family in New Hampshire.
Do we know approximately what year this was, Bonnie?
This was, actually, it was July 3rd, 1834.
1834.
So, and Daniel Whitney was known as the original Chamber of Commerce for Wisconsin Territory. And he would go out, and people, if they needed somebody with a particular skill, he would go out, find somebody with that skill, convince them to move wherever he needed them. And Robert Wakely was frequently away from the farm, And my guess is he and Daniel ran across each other.
Maybe on the Erie Canal?
I would guess Whitney's were on the Erie Canal.
And Wakely could have been, and from what your notes have been, is that the Wakely's farm was maybe just 17 miles or so from the Erie Canal.
Right. Well, Batavia, and they were outside of Batavia, so it might have even been closer.
Yes.
But I could see Daniel giving him the, oh, hey, we're opening up new territory as soon as we sign this treaty with the Indians, and it's going to open up northern Wisconsin to lumbering, and we're going to need an inn. Robert Wakely's brother was an innkeeper in Pennsylvania, so he had some idea about running an inn and maybe even had experience. And so in September of 35, Mary and Daniel had sold the farm, or Mary and Robert had sold the farm, bought a lumber raft with the money they got from the farm, and they had hired, I think it was 8 men and 2 women, and they set off down the Allegheny River to the Ohio, and down the Ohio as far as Cincinnati, where they stopped, and either he sold the lumber raft there, or he left Mary and the kids in Cincinnati and took the raft down to St. Louis. We don't know.
Someplace, Bonnie, we had talked about too that maybe he wintered, because this territory wasn't really open to settlement, that maybe he wintered waiting, because he knew that Cedar Point Treaty, which it ended up being, was going to be signed in the next year or so, that
Right.
that would open up this area, and he was working his way towards Point Basse to take advantage of this opportunity at the right proper time.
And it took longer to get everybody together to sign the treaty than Whitney thought it should. And so they waited in Cincinnati, and I don't know if they had some kind of a connection in Cincinnati or what, but they spent over a year, about a year and a half in Cincinnati. The Cedar Point Treaty was signed in September of 1836, and that was too late to go to Wisconsin. However, during the summer of 36, he met Daniel Whitney at Portage City, now Portage, and Daniel took him up, showed him how to stake his claim, and Daniel had a sawmill at Whitney Rapids, which is the island. If you go across the Nakusa Bridge, if you look off to the east, there's a little island left. That was Whitney's Rapids, and that's where his sawmill was.
So Daniel Whitney was an early pioneer, and probably had been since the late 1820s or something in Wisconsin, or Wisconsin Territory at that time, looking for opportunities between Green Bay and Necedah and Helena and all kinds of places.
He had general stores around the state. He settled in Green Bay in 1820 and opened up a store there right across from Fort Howard, where he had military he could sell to, and you had settlers starting to come in. And then he opened a second store at Great Kaukauna, or Grand Kaukauna, I think now Kaukauna.
Mhm.
And it just, he needed people, and he was able to find, he needed a blacksmith at, well, let's just say Green Bay. He didn't call it Green Bay then. But he needed a blacksmith, he found a blacksmith. He needed a tinsmith, he found a tinsmith. He needed a woodworker, he found a woodworker. Whatever he needed, he was able to find, convince him to move to Wisconsin.
So most of this recruitment came from upstate New York.
Well, but
Or-
Daniel walked from Detroit to Green Bay at one point. He was out and about.
Mhm.
So it may have come, but he was other places also, and frequently to St. Louis. So I mean, who knows?
He covered a lot of territory, in other
Yeah.
words. And I think your remark that he was the Wisconsin's chief advocate for kind of the Chamber of Commerce of Wisconsin, you're right, because of all the different connections he made and all the enterprises he had going at the same time.
Yeah.
I think a lot of times we don't realize when we're talking about history that there was a lot of things happening nationally in the United States at that time, which was, just basically east of the Mississippi, and some of that was territory yet. That there was depressions, there was land runs, there was all kinds of things going on, and so there was a number of factors that pushed people out. Besides wanting to do better, some of them just had to go somewhere because there was no livelihood to be made where they presently lived.
And Wisconsin looked like a good place in that we had all kinds of just gorgeous timber, and the logging people were just waiting to get in. However, at this point it was still illegal. And at one point Whitney had made an arrangement with the Menominee and Ho-Chunk Indians, and he built a shingle mill near Point Basse. And from what I understand, it would have been in the vicinity where the dirty ore is now. However, he made the agreement with the Indians, not with the U.S. government. And so the U.S. government sent the army up from Fort Winnebago under the leadership of Lieutenant Jefferson Davis.
Yes, which
They tore down the mill, stole the shingles, and carried them back to Fort Winnebago.
And they built their fort there and used it for some of their buildings in that fort.
They improved the roofs on some of their buildings.
I suppose they figured it was just confiscated materials.
Right.
So why not make use of this? Because otherwise we're not just going to burn them,
Right.
Somebody went through the trouble to make these. They're illegal, but we'll use them.
Oh, you can't just let them lay. They were green.
Yes.
The mill he built at Whitney Rapids, he had an agreement with the U.S. government as well as the Menominee. And so that one was legal.
That was probably built before Cedar Point Treaty was signed too.
That was, yes, the mill was already there then.
Okay.
I want to say, I'm not certain just what the year.
But it's pre-1836.
It's pre-1836.
Yes.
So, and then he had Indians running it, and they probably were Stockbridge, because the Stockbridge came from New York, and in New York they worked with what the Indians call the Euros. And so they spoke English. They had work ethics that were more conducive to what the white man thought of as a work ethic. And so my guess is most of the Indians were Stockbridge. And they lived in a village across Point Basse. So the Wakeleys had Indians for neighbors who were used to white men. Mary probably, and the Wakeley kids probably played with them.
Yeah, and like you mentioned, probably most of them speaking English too.
Right. Yeah, the Stockbridge would have. Now the reference I saw said it was mixed Indians, about 100 mixed Indians. So there probably were some Ho-Chunk and Menominee thrown in. And the Stockbridge at that point were...
That must have been quite an operation when you think of 100 workers there.
Well, but that's 100 Indians.
Yeah, but that's still
But that
a lot.
would have been women and children
Oh,
also.
100 in the community.
Yeah.
Okay, not the workers at
Not
the sawmill.
workers, yeah.
Maybe a dozen at the sawmill,
Right.
but the families, extended families, was a village of 100.
Right. So, it was one of those things. One point I came across the boat that Daniel and Emmeline were on. They met Dr. William Beaumont, who is the Army surgeon who treated a young man with a stomach wound up at
Michilimackinac.
yeah, and it healed, and he could always watch the stomach. And he happened to be a passenger on that boat. He was returning to St. Louis, and also was a general and Mrs. William Ashley, and she was a descendant of Pocahontas.
Ah,
And they were both on the boat, which I thought, wow, hey. And so,
can you give us an idea of, Bonnie, the dimensions of this boat and size? Is it like the 80 feet long sort of thing?
let's see. I think it was 70 ton.
Mhm.
Uh,
Pulled by horses, right, or mules?
no, this was the boat going on the Great Lakes.
Oh, the Great Lakes one, not
Yeah.
not the one on the Erie.
The canal boats were about 14 foot wide and 80 or 90 foot long.
Okay.
And the front of the boat was reserved for women and children and had a curtain across it. And at mealtime, the curtain was taken down and they ran a table from the front to the back, and everybody sat down and ate. Supposedly very good food.
Mhm. All prepared on the canal boat, I'm assuming.
I wouldn't assume so, yeah, because
on the deck.
there weren't too many drive-ins along the way. And the boat was pulled by horses or mules. And they normally had one spare team, so the horses or mules would go about 10 miles and then they would trade. And when they got within 20 miles, they probably had another station where they would change the animals and have fresh ones.
Yeah.
And they could do about 50 to 60 miles a day.
That's a considerable amount of travel.
It is.
So that whole Erie Canal, they could probably do in like about 4 days or something?
5 days
5
was
days.
the normal. From Albany to Buffalo.
Buffalo, 5 days, which took a considerable lot of time out of that
Yeah.
travel.
Yep.
If it would have been by stage or some other way,
And a whole lot more comfortable than
Right.
the stage.
Yes.
And there was a stage line that ran somewhat parallel, but and I guess was cheaper,
Mhm.
but you had more comfort
Right.
on the canal boat. So, and
Wasn't that canal boat quite costly? I heard it was like
it was
$1 a
it was
mile.
more expensive than a stagecoach would have been. But when you look at how rough a stagecoach was and how crowded, when you figure you had 9 people in this little box, you had and the middle seat had a leather strap to lean against, and your knees interchanged with the knees of the person across from you.
Not very interesting to travel that way, especially for more than 1 day or something. And then plus,
more than 1 hour.
plus we got to look at too, on the canal boat, you could sleep there.
Right.
On this, you're going to have to stay at inns along the way, so if it's a little cheaper, by the time you end up with those inn costs and the food costs, it's probably going to be almost fairly close in proximity.
Well, in what I've read about the inns, I don't know that I wanted to stay or eat there. The food was, well, it depended on the person running the stage station, but a lot of it, the food was barely edible.
Well, and you got to realize that most of those people that ran those inns had almost a monopoly. There was no other inns around, so
Right.
if you're going to stop, well, this is your choice.
Yeah, and the beds, you went to the cupboard and you took out the cleanest sheets and put them on your bed.
It seems by today's standards anyway, kind of primitive, and certainly in those days it was probably a step above something else. So.
And a good one even furnished a toothbrush. They had it hanging out by the trough where you washed up in the morning and you could brush your teeth if you wanted to.
And it was a general purpose toothbrush for everybody.
Right, the toothbrush.
Well, I think that sounds interesting.
It was well experienced.
And I'm sure in those days it was made from pig bristles because that's what they usually made toothbrushes from in those days. So,
Yeah. So,
Wakely's probably stayed in Cincinnati for a year and a half.
about a year and a half.
And then when the treaty was signed, probably went on to St. Louis early spring, and then came up the river.
No, they didn't go down to, because St. Louis is south of where the Ohio runs into the Mississippi.
So they probably just
So they
went
went
up.
right up the Mississippi, up to Wisconsin to Portage City.
Mhm.
And
And how did their connections go there? Did this Daniel Whitney figure in that again?
they used Daniel's keel boat to go up to Point Basse. And Wakely had part of the help he needed because the boat was walked up the river. And they'd have 7 men on each side, plus one running the rudder in the back. And it had long poles, they'd plant them in the bottom of the river and then just walk forward. And as they walked forward, they'd push the boat up. They'd pick up their poles, plant them again.
Do we have any idea what kind of timeline this would take to get from like Portage to Point Basse?
They could go about 15 miles a day. And so it was about 5 days from Portage to Point Basse.
About the same amount of time as the Erie Canal.
Right.
They're traveling from
And
Alabama.
about the same as a horse.
Yeah.
And at night, they would tie up on the shore. They'd find a nice stable tree, wrap it up, tie the keel boat to it. And on the keel boat, they could have livestock. So Mary and Robert probably had some of what they were going to need to start.
And certainly probably things such as that we take for granted that you could purchase. Certainly you couldn't purchase here at Point Basse because there was no community.
There was no,
And so they probably brought their cast iron stove, their kitchen stove, and some of those important things that they're not going to find available otherwise.
Or they may not have had a stove, they may have cooked out of a fireplace.
For the first year or so.
And I don't know, but I wouldn't be a bit surprised if in 36, when he met Daniel Whitney and they went up, they wouldn't have built some kind of a shelter. So when they got there.
Even just a lean-to or something.
Yeah.
Or a cabin or something like that.
And Daniel had access to helping hands. He had a sawmill. And so they could have built a cabin. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I think in the conjecture, we don't know when the Wakely home was built, but we're thinking 1841, maybe 1842, because we think actually, and I think from your information, Bonnie, that actually they probably built the inn first.
They built a trading post first, and then he built a warehouse, and then he built an inn. And then he built the house.
Yes.
Because he found he had Indians across the river who had furs and whatnot, and they wanted some of the things that the white man had. So he opened a trading post. Plus other people were starting to come up. And then, because they could bring goods up the river as far as Point Basse, and from there it had to go by land, he now needed a warehouse to store things in until a wagon could be used to take it up to Stevens Point.
Yeah, we'll let you know, folks, that at Point Basse, it's the last rapids on the Wisconsin River. So from Point Basse down, at least in the Wakely's day, all the way down to the Mississippi River, and from there, wherever you want to go, there was no impediments other than the rapids and was very little of that past Point Basse. So if you wanted to go north, you had to keep fording these different rapids. And so it was a long and tedious process, and you can imagine when you did this once or twice, but every 4 or 5 miles you got the same thing. Of course, where we find our power, our hydroelectric plants and our paper mills today, for the next 100 miles you got this about every 5 miles.
Yeah.
So it's quite a process. So they went overland, actually, more people on that Portage to Plover Road or whatever rudimentary road there was at that time. and went overland, took their goods, stored it in the warehouse like Bonnie was saying, at Point Basse. Robert made that available, because when you come up, don't necessarily have arrangements to move it further north. You make arrangements, then move it as time allows it to be done.
Yeah, at that point, there was no such thing as a schedule.
Right.
You know, even boats coming into Green Bay, you didn't know. They're out there and they may come up, and it was hard to get to Green Bay because the city was built on the Fox River, and sometimes the Fox River was too low to bring a boat up, or you had to load it onto a smaller boat and bring it up.
So it could be a process.
Yes.
Sort of thing. So I think that there was a couple of people that had written before, I think some of the surveyors or something, that the site of Point Basse, the Wakely site, across from the Nakusa, across the river from Nakusa, was one of the best spots on the central part of Wisconsin, on the Wisconsin River. And it was one of the best places to develop. And I'm thinking that's probably what Whitney passed on to Robert Wakely during maybe he was up here once, twice, maybe during that time while they were waiting it out in Cincinnati. And that's probably the information he got at that time to come up.
Well, and when they started bringing lumber rafts and logging rafts down, we're now through all the rapids. And so they would stop for a day or two and tie everything up tight again, because if it came apart down the river, everything's floating in all directions. You just lost.
Yeah.
And
the thing to know about the lumber rafts, the people that worked on them were called suckers. Of course, there was, a river pilot like Chauncey Wakely was that would get them through the rapids. But once they went south of Point Basse, it was pretty low, slow moving water. The biggest impediment was sandbars. So what would happen is these rats, ones that worked on the lumber rafts, the suckers, wouldn't get paid until they finally brought that lumber to wherever its destination was Nuavo, or if it was St. Louis, or wherever it might be. They didn't get paid. So these people were coming up from Illinois, mostly farmers, trying to make some money so they could buy seed and plant their crop. So they were very, very careful with this, because they didn't get paid along the way as they went down this 3-week trip or whatever it was from northern Wisconsin to St. Louis. They got paid when the final destination came. And if that lumber raft should fall apart and they not have any lumber and it dissipates, they don't get paid. So they've just worked 2 or 3 weeks for nothing.
Yeah, and so they'd tie up their rafts at Point Basse before they continued. And they had just come through the Grand Rapids, which started about Wisconsin Rapids and pretty much went all the way down to Point Basse. So it was a big, and it's just one series of rapids after another. So.
And then at Point Basse, they could also tie maybe 2 rafts side by side, because from now on the river would be wider and shallower, and they could probably do. If you see any of the H.H. Bennett pictures, you see the guys in the lumber rafts working with levers trying to get it off. Well, what they're doing is trying to get it off the sandbars that are in the southern Wisconsin River, where it meanders around, and that's why they had to take it in the springtime. It wasn't so much the rapids in the Point Basse area or Grand Rapids or the Wausau area or anything. I think it was actually those sandbars got to be more of a detriment as the season went on, because the water was so low.
Well, and in places they would build a dam, and when they got ready, they'd tear the dam out, because in the meantime the water would build up, and so now we can ride the crest down. And they learned all kinds of tricks to get their timber out of the north woods.
And that timber had to be getting out mostly during the spring when the water was high, after the snow melt and that sort of thing, or in the fall if you had a freshet, a lot of rain, because the newspapers in Grand Rapids, Centralia, Wisconsin, which is today Wisconsin Rapids, record 100 of those going through a day. So that lumber did no good in northern Wisconsin. You couldn't make a penny on it up there because it was too plentiful. But down in the prairie country, Missouri, Iowa, Illinois, where they had very little trees other than hardwoods along the rivers, this soft white pine was a great building material for their construction down there.
And it lasted a long time. It was a very hardy wood.
I think a lot of pitch or resin in it that
Yeah.
probably was good, and it could be used and worked by anybody. Where you get into hardwoods, it takes a little bit of work to work with that. This could be done at any time at that point.
Okay. So we got Mary and Robert to Point Basse. And immediately we've got to start preparing for winter because we have to have enough food for ourselves. Nothing's been planted. So, and the work, I mean, you probably had several inches of sod, so you can't just dig it up a little bit. You got roots that go down maybe a foot.
Right.
Now, if you get out on the prairie, they may have gone down 2 or 3 feet. And so we had to start putting seeds, and I'm sure they brought the seeds with them. There's probably enough grass that they could harvest for the animals, but we needed food. Now, some things grow wild and they could be harvested, but they had to get potatoes in and, you know, whatnot.
Rutabagas, anything that would be preserved. And that's why when Bonnie was talking earlier about the Cedar Point Treaty was signed in September of 1836, they didn't come in September. They could do none of this. That's why they came on June 2nd, 1837, because they had the ability now to grow their crops and start building some shelters maybe for their cattle or something like that, because otherwise, you know, there's no store to go to. The people are going to starve because there's nothing around. They can trade a little bit with the Native Americans, but that's limited to maybe...
And we don't know how willing they're going to be to trade.
Yeah.
Now, the Native Americans did harvest cranberries and trade them. They'd send canoes full of cranberries down the Wisconsin River to Portage City, where the army would buy them because they were good to prevent scurvy.
And I think it was one of the few crops that actually the natives harvested and actually did a pretty good job of it too, actually considering that they were pretty much wild marshes, things that were just growing in the area where they were living.
So, but, you know, and the canning was not available then. The mason jar wasn't invented until 1857. So you had nothing to package things in. So everything had to be dried or pickled. Smoked. And so you were very limited in how to preserve this stuff.
Yes. And I think down at the Point Basse, of course, a few folks have noticed that over the years we have an ice house. Well, I don't think in 1837 they had an ice house, maybe within a year or two or something, they got something going. But the ice was also a way of preserving things, because this year, because of COVID and everything else, our site wasn't open as much as usual. I think we had about 3 events this year versus 8 or whatever. And our ice, when we took out ice, and it was end of September, there was still some ice there, early October, end of September, but not a lot. Of course, in the Wakeleys' day, they would have had a greater mass. The more the mass you got, the longer you can keep it. And you know, as we're talking here, end of October, I'm thinking already ahead, you know, I got to start making arrangements for shavings and stuff, and start to think about, you know, ice harvest the end of January on Nepco Lake with the Port Edwards Lions. So, you know, that the season changes. Now you got to go to the next thing. You know, the wheels are turning all the time, whether we are or not.
But Robert had a sawmill just a mile up the river from him, and sawmills always had lots of sawdust.
Yes.
In fact, it was a real problem. Oshkosh is built on sawdust from the mills. They went out to the river, they dumped it in the shore. Well, then the river started to get clogged, so well, we got to be careful with this.
Then they probably put it on some wetlands or something.
They
they'd
filled
fill it
in
up.
whatever.
Yes. Of course, that lasted probably about 5 years or so, and then that
Yeah.
starts sinking.
In Kimberly, the sawdust underground caught fire, and so most of the residents had to live in the woods that year because the smoke was so bad. So sawdust was a real problem.
And for the people that had ice houses, it was a great boon because they could get rid of this problem for the sawmills and reuse it for a higher purpose.
Yeah,
And I don't think, nowadays, of course, the paper mills, they burn shavings and stuff like that, and they use it for horse bedding and things like that. But in those days, they didn't think of that really. And where they didn't have sawdust, I think they used mostly like hay or straw in between the blocks of ice to preserve it. So.
or just plain savanna grass that grew, which they could likewise harvest to feed their cattle. But it's kind of mind-boggling, okay, how do we figure out what we can use, what we can't use? Because we want to keep our cattle if at all possible.
And that's kind of an interesting question. I think all of us at Point Basse have had it asked of us at least once, and for me anyway, many times is, would you like to live during that time? I says, no, I says, this is about as close as I like to get to. And I kind of enjoy it, but I do like to go take a shower eventually, and I like a bed. I don't have to worry about bed bugs in it or something. I mean,
You don't have to tighten the ropes every morning.
it's a very romantic idea to say that, oh, wouldn't you like to live in that era? Certainly it'd be a simpler life, but it'd be actually a life of subsistence.
You don't have to go down to the river at night to fill your water pail so the silt and mud has a chance to settle by morning so you can drink it or use it.
Yes. I mean, that's even without the river ever being polluted. It's just the way the river is. It's silty bottom and comes out of the tamarack swamps in northern Wisconsin. So it's always got that kind of a brownish color to it no matter what. But the Wakeleys came in 1837, and you're thinking, Bonnie, the warehouse and the kind of trading post probably built in like 38, 39? 18.
Well, possibly even 37. Although they would have had a lot to do just breaking sod and that. But he did bring men with him.
Right.
And 2 women, so there were people to help with. It wasn't just Mary and Robert against the wilderness.
Yes.
They did have people, so they could very well have built the trading post. Warehouse maybe wasn't necessary that first year, but
I have a question, because I heard that there was a trading post here in 1827, the Greeno Portier. Would that structure have maybe still been here?
that would have been further south. That would have been in the Dirty Ore area.
They're down near what, the 10 Mile Creek comes in down there?
Someplace like that, because
I thought that was Greeno's mill, but the trading post is actually here at Point Basse.
I think it was further south.
it was further south. It was from my guess, they told what river bend it was on. Well, that river bend isn't there anymore because somebody built a dam and the river's a little different than it was then. But it would have been down in the Dirty Ore hideaway area. And Greeno's had a baby, and they're very good Catholics. They wanted it baptized. So they put Mr. and Mrs. Greeno and the baby, got in a canoe, went down to Portage, portaged over to the Fox River, up the Fox River to Grand Chute, had the baby baptized, got in the canoe, and returned. And it's kind of like,
It was probably a 2-3 week trip. Huh?
I would guess so,
Yeah, unless he took some paddlers besides himself, because his wife could paddle some, but limited.
She had a baby to tend.
Yeah.
So.
And when Bonnie talks about Robert Wakely bringing a couple women and some men with him to help with the construction of whatever they did and to get started, because their kids, when they came, there was just 2 boys, and then a daughter would be born,
In December,
in December that year, that these kids were young, they were like,
they were 3 and 1, I think.
yeah, and so they wouldn't have been much use for, when we talk about helping. Certainly in later years, they were a good help.
In fact, they were probably a hindrance because,
Right.
but parents used to stake their children.
Like
They
would-
put them on a rope and a stake, and now they can go just so far.
like a horse,
Right.
yeah.
And a tiny baby, if mom has to work in the garden,
Strap
she
it
would
up.
lay the baby against the saddle, and it would keep the baby kind of in place and somewhat comfortable.
Or maybe they took some thoughts from the Native Americans where they put like a little pack on and carried the baby in the pack or the front or the back or something. Like nowadays you see
Yeah.
some women that are working or something, well, they have the baby in the front or the back and they kind of do their things. When the baby's small, they're pretty happy just to be there,
Yeah.
close to
Well,
home.
and all you do, and by the time a kid was 5, they were in charge of watching the little ones.
Mhm.
And while they maybe couldn't actually, if they had a problem, they couldn't do anything, but they could run and get mom.
Sure.
And okay, baby is crying, or baby fell, or
Mhm. Mhm.
so
Yeah.
kids had a lot of responsibility very young.
Well, I think it goes with that kind of subsistence life that
Right.
they had to.
You,
I
you
mean,
don't have an option.
Right, right. Let's talk a little bit about the Wakely family and what transpired there, Bonnie. You want to go through a little bit? I think one of the sons was lost in the river just outside of the house
Yeah.
there, pretty much.
Well, someplace on the river, Robert Wakely the Fourth, who was the 1-year-old when they came, at about the age of 12, fell off a lumber raft, and they never found his body. And they had 9 children. Robert was lost at about 12, and they had another son, William, who was about 7th or so down the line. He was born in 1845. He's listed in the 1850 census. He's not listed in the 50. He's not listed in the 1860 census. So sometime between 1850 and 1860, he died. We don't know why or of what.
Mhm.
And to my knowledge, they don't have a grave for him.
Right, because the Wakeleys are buried in Calvary Cemetery.
Right.
In Wisconsin Rapids here, so you can go out to the grave sites and we've had some events out there when it's a particular anniversary or whatever, that sort of thing, but they're both buried. The rest of the kids kind of migrated further west. I
Yeah.
think Chauncey, I believe, was buried in Iowa, and some of the other ones I think got as far as...
Martha, the one who was born in December, I think died in Utah.
Mhm.
We met one from Montana who was doing a family tree and found out quite by accident that the family had come from Nakusa, and she called the city hall in Nakusa, and well, they couldn't help her, but they knew if they called the library, I think it was Carol Blisky,
Mhm.
and so she found out that the family home was being preserved, and they were heading to Indiana on vacation, so they stopped, and we had lunch for them out there, and at that point the house is far from done, and she is in tears as she saw this house, her great-grandfather's or great whatever, and it was just kind of neat that.
And she saw that, and she had no idea that this
Yeah.
home would ever be preserved or would be any record of it anymore.
Yeah, and didn't even know where exactly, but she had seen, someplace came across the reference Nakusa,
Mhm.
so she called and,
Yeah. We've had a number of those instances. In fact, at the Winter Feast the last couple of years, we've had family come from Utah and California and that sort of thing, which is really nice because, in this case, elderly woman, I think about 90, her son asked her, what do you wanna do for
Your
your
90th birthday.
birthday? Well, I wanna go to Point Basse. I wanna go to Nakusa. Nakusa?
She had heard about Winter Feast, so they came to Winter Feast.
Yes, yeah, I think they were members or whatever, so they probably got a mailing or whatever. And they came to Winter Feast, unbeknownst, I think other than a couple days before, we kinda got word that they were coming, so. And then came the next year, came this past year now.
There is an interview on public access too,
Yes.
or at least YouTube, and they are active members now.
Yes, yes, and I think her and her son may be here, I think maybe because of COVID might be another thing. We don't even know at this point ourselves what's gonna happen or what's not gonna happen, just because right now we're in a big flare up here, and if you had anything going on, you probably would walk
It would
back.
be frowned on.
You'd be walking it back by now, though in early November, I think the people at Babcock with the horse thing are supposed to have something at Nakusa thing, a dinner. I thought it was chicken and it was something else, and it was early November, and I was a little surprised, but maybe they had planned this 3 months ago when the numbers weren't especially bad, but I'm sure that they'll walk that back if there's a problem. Bonnie, you've been involved a lot of years and certainly a lot of this research, and you've mentioned to me a number of times, oh, I wish I would have kept that reference where I got that from, because you went through a lot of different things when you put your books together and your teachers' copies and that sort of thing. But when we look back at it, would you ever think you'd see this kind of development at Point Basse and the involvement we've had from hundreds of people over the years to get to this point? I mean, you look back, you taught in Nakusa schools for years, and you were active in that time and also been active since your retirement, but I think either one of us would have had a concept that would be looking at
The
this.
really sad part, I mean, the Wakeleys were not writers. They did not keep a journal. And the thing that amazes me is, how do we know they came here June 2nd, 1937? That is the only
date we got firm.
date we have.
Right.
And it's like,
Where did they get that from?
yeah, where did it come from?
Yeah. It makes sense that they come early in the growing season, but how is this June 2nd, 1837?
Okay, June 1837, yeah, but June 2nd?
Yes.
It's, and if only they did keep a journal.
Yeah.
Oh,
Well, we know, traveling around to a lot of historic sites, you've done a lot, I've done a lot, Don, who's doing the filming today, has done a lot. Some of these places are pristine because somebody kept a journal or records or something, and they know how much that, piece of furniture cost and everything, and then they got all the original furnishings, and you say, holy cow, you die and go to heaven for something like that.
Yeah.
Because we got a little prayer book from one of the girls, and we got a couple other odd and end items, but really nothing to speak of.
we have a copy of some adoption papers that Mary Wakely witnessed for somebody. So we do have Mary Wakely's signature.
Mhm.
I don't think we have Robert's.
Well, we do, but and of course, it's kind of interesting that we're talking about Robert Wakely now, that he signed petitions for having a post office at Point Basse. And first petition didn't get through, didn't get any action on it, so they sent a second petition from local residents around here, and even, up in Grand Rapids, and what we call Grand Rapids, Centralia, Wisconsin Rapids today, which didn't exist then, that he spelled his last name different on both petitions. So it's like, oh, okay, that's kind of interesting. Is they think you wouldn't get it because you spelled it the same way on the first one or something? I don't know, but he was a postmaster from 1845 to 1850, just a small five-year window. But when they had a list of his revenues that was collected, and he was taking in like $17 or $20 a year, versus when Grand Rapids was founded, they were taking in like $100. So it was.
Yeah, but Grand Rapids by that time was much larger.
Right.
Point Basse was very rapidly on the decline. Originally, the Pinery Road kind of followed what is now County Trunk Z. And so it went through wetlands, you know, it was not a good road. And about 1850, they improved the road and they moved it to what is now basically Highway 13, which was level and you didn't have to worry about getting hung up in a swamp. And now the road is 4 miles away from Point Basse.
We're off the
beaten path. And
Yeah.
that was the decline of
And-
Point Basse.
And that same thing, you know, happened with the water power. Robert and Moses Strong, who was down from Madison area, joined together trying to harness the water power here at Point Basse and Coosa. But it was during the Civil War when he had a couple of his boys in the Civil War and the cousins were there and there was no manpower to get the job done. So that kind of fell by the wayside. And then of course it was eventually done by other parties. And then the railroad went on the west side of the river and it spelled the end. Otherwise today we'd be visiting Nakusa as a historic community and Point Basse would be still going.
Right. And the railroad ended up west of the river because Stevens Point or Portage County would not improve the road. Marathon County improved it to the county line and then it's this old. And so when the railroad came, they worked to put it on the west side of the river so Stevens Point would benefit from it.
They bypass them then.
Yeah, my great-grandfather was one of the county board people up in Marathon County who says, we're not gonna let Stevens Point have the railroad. And so we have Junction City today because of it.
Yeah, and that's where it went through there, up through Portage County to Marathon County rather than going over east to.
Stevens Point wasn't gonna benefit from it.
Yeah, and there was you know, we talk about that kind of parochialism, but I mean, we even have it today, you know, somebody gets something in one community, the other community is jealous about it. I mean, they're still fighting, they've been fighting for hundreds, probably thousands of years. I mean, it's kind of crazy, but Bonnie, I want to thank you for coming on today and the Historic Point Basse update and giving the information about Wakely's. I always consider you our Historic Point Basse's authority. Thank you for all your research and time. Even putting this together for today, I know you probably worked on that many hours yesterday trying to get it solidified so you had a kind of a thing you could follow and you could go with it. And so I appreciate that and all your time and efforts you've done for our site and our organization over the years.
Well, I filled in one hole because I found out Kemper was the journal.
Yeah, and Bonnie also found out that Daniel Whitney's relation helped found the Green Bay Packers.
His great-grandson is one of the founders of the Green Bay Packers.
Yeah, and of course, since they had pretty much their Whitney family, the headquarters was Green Bay, it makes sense that some of the relatives grew up there and families stayed on.
Calhoun, I think, was his last name.
George something Calhoun.
George Whitney Calhoun.
Right. So thank you everybody for coming on board today and watching this. We appreciate it. We're going to do more of these. It's our way to keep in touch with you, and so it's a great time for all of us to participate in the way we can during this COVID. So thank you very much.